You mentioned you're in Afghanistan first of all, then you wake up in Birmingham.
Yeah.
The games are back in the UK next July.
Yeah.
Birmingham. How nice is it to actually come full circle and have that where everyone's recovery tends to start? Is it starting?
Yeah. So for those that were wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, like we all got flown into Birmingham Airport and you woke up in either Selly Oak, the military hospital, or the Queen Elizabeth, Birmingham. And like, that begins your recovery. And like Birmingham...
Just imagine that though, like you're literally like the last memory you had was in the sand, and the Chinook coming down. Not everybody was Kazabak from the, but certainly from when you were coming back to Birmingham, you were, and then you're either dying, you're either blacked out, or you're put into an induced coma, and the next minute you wake up is with your family leaning over you, and you're in a hospital bed back in the UK.
Yeah. And so, like what this city means to the armed forces, but to the wounded, injured, and sick, and especially the wounded of our generation, like it's unquantifiable. Like, so it's nice. I've always loved this place. I'll always, know that I owe it my life. So to come back and have a different experience of it is like, that's amazing.
It's going to be special.
Yeah, there's a lot of reconnections happening as well with the clinicians that saved these guys' lives, put them back together again. Like Josh, who's part of our Invictus Games Foundation, he was over there earlier and he hadn't been back for 15 years. Triple amputee and reconnected with his clinician and who's still working there.
Yeah, amazing.
So it means a lot. There's a lot of heart and emotion to the reason why Birmingham is hosting the next Games.
So genuinely, that from our point of view, there's probably not another city in the world that has that level of connection to this particular moment in history as well. Like that conflict, which ultimately started the Invictus Games. Obviously it sadly engulfs so many more conflicts in parts of the world and more countries than ever. But it was born out of, because when you talk about like Invictus Spirit, this thing we've created, where that was actually born wasn't in London in 2014. Like it was called that in London in 2014. It was born in Ward 412 in Birmingham Hospital. Like that's where the unconquered surviving thing began.
A society needs more role models, people like this. That's what the Invictus has proven. Like we just created the platform, and they say, thanks to me. They say thanks to the team. It's like we just help facilitate your recovery so that you can show the world who you really.
Imagine this. Your last memory is lying in sand, hearing a Chinook helicopter thunder down to pull you out. And then nothing. You black out. You go into an induced coma, and the very next thing you register isn't a battlefield. It's your family leaning over a hospital bed, and you have absolutely no idea how much time has passed or how you got there. That is not a scene from a movie. That is the actual lived reality of British soldiers who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the city where that story ends, the city where they wake up, is Birmingham. Squaddies, welcome back. Today we're talking about a conversation that dropped this week, and honestly it's one of the more powerful things Prince Harry has said in a long time. He sat down with rugby legend Joe Marler on the Joe Marler Will See You Now podcast, alongside Invictus Games ambassador and former Royal Marine JJ Chalmers, and the two of them explained, in raw, unscripted terms, exactly why Birmingham was chosen to host the Invictus Games in 2027. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this isn't just a sports event. It's personal, it's medical, it's practically sacred to the veteran community. And once you hear the reasoning, you'll understand why the tabloid machine has been so quiet about it. Because there's no scandal angle here. There's no royal rift to manufacture. There's just a genuinely moving story about service, survival, and coming full circle. So let's get into it. Here's something most people outside the veteran community simply don't know. If you were a British soldier seriously wounded in Iraq or Afghanistan, there's a very specific route your body took to get home. you'd be flown out of the combat zone, and more often than not, you'd land at Birmingham International Airport. From there, you'd be rushed either to Selly Oak Hospital, the old military hospital, or to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Birmingham, which became the receiving centre for the UK's most catastrophically injured service members. Joe Marler put it to Harry and JJ directly: you go to sleep in Afghanistan and you wake up in Birmingham. And what Harry and JJ described next is genuinely hard to sit with. For a huge number of these soldiers, the trip home wasn't something they experienced consciously. Many were sedated, in induced comas, or simply unconscious from trauma. The last thing they remember is the sand, the heat, the chaos, the sound of rotor blades. And then the next thing they know, they're opening their eyes in a hospital bed in the West Midlands, with their families gathered around them, trying to process the fact that days, sometimes weeks, have just disappeared. JJ Chalmers, who lost fingers and suffered severe facial injuries in an IED explosion in Afghanistan in 2011, spoke about this with the kind of clarity you only get from someone who actually lived it. He wasn't romanticizing trauma. He was explaining a medical and emotional reality that Birmingham has quietly carried for nearly 2 decades, largely without recognition. Harry, who served 2 tours in Afghanistan himself as an Apache helicopter pilot, backed him up with something close to reverence in his voice. He said that what this city means to the armed forces, and specifically to the wounded, injured, and sick from his generation of conflict, is, in his words, unquantifiable. Think about that phrasing for a second. Unquantifiable. Not important, not meaningful, unquantifiable. That's the language of someone who has watched friends go through this exact process and knows there isn't a number, a statistic, or a headline that can capture what Birmingham represents to that community. So now you understand the emotional backbone of the decision. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because Birmingham isn't just a city that happened to host some hospitals near an airport. According to Harry and JJ, it's genuinely the epicentre of this entire recovery ecosystem, and there may not be another city on the planet with this specific level of connection to the story of wounded veterans from this era of conflict. JJ made a point that deserves way more attention than it's gotten. The Invictus spirit, the actual concept, the unconquered, never-giving-up mentality that eventually became a global movement, wasn't born at the London 2014 launch. London is where it got its name. But the real origin point, the place where that spirit was actually forged, was Ward 412 at a Birmingham hospital. That's the ward where wounded soldiers began their recovery, where they relearned how to walk, how to hold a cup, how to simply exist in a body that had been permanently changed by war. That ward is where the unconquered surviving identity that defines Invictus first took shape, years before Harry ever put a stage and a logo around it. And then there's the reconnection angle, which honestly might be the most emotional part of this whole story. Harry and JJ talked about a man named Josh, part of the Invictus Games Foundation team, who is a triple amputee. Josh recently went back to that same Birmingham hospital for the first time in over a decade, 13, maybe 15 years, and reconnected with the actual clinician who saved his life. That clinician is still working there, still treating patients, still part of the same recovery pipeline that once rebuilt Josh from the ground up. That's not PR. That's not a photo opportunity engineered by a comms team. That's a real human being walking back into the building where his life was put back together and finding the person who did it, still doing the work, all these years later. If that doesn't hit you somewhere, honestly, check your pulse. Now, let's talk about why this matters beyond the Invictus announcement itself, because this is where the contrast with how Harry gets covered in the UK press becomes impossible to ignore. For years, certain sections of the British tabloid media have worked overtime to paint Harry as detached from Britain, disconnected from his old military identity, somehow diminished by stepping back from royal duties. You've heard the narratives. He's gone Hollywood. He's lost touch. He's trading on his royal title instead of doing real work. We've debunked variations of this so many times on this channel, it's almost muscle memory at this point. But listen to how Harry actually talks about Birmingham. This isn't a man performing sentimentality for cameras. This is a former Apache pilot talking with real specificity about hospital wards, about clinicians by name, about the literal flight path wounded soldiers took home from war. This is a man who still tracks what happens to the people he served alongside, who still shows up for the unglamorous, unscandalous parts of veteran care that don't generate clicks. There's no palace intrigue in a story about Ward 412. There's no rift, no feud, no source close to the family drama. It's just Harry doing what he's actually built his post-royal identity around, advocacy for wounded veterans, and doing it with the kind of granular knowledge you can't fake. And that's precisely why you probably didn't see this story dominating the front pages. It doesn't fit the narrative certain outlets have spent years constructing. A moving, detailed, emotionally intelligent conversation about veteran recovery doesn't sell papers the way a manufactured royal feud does. So instead of leading with it, most of the UK media either buried it, clipped it down to nothing, or ignored it outright. Meanwhile, here we are, breaking down the full context, because, unlike the royal rota, we actually think this story deserves the attention. So, what does this actually mean going forward? Birmingham is set to host the Invictus Games in 2027. And based on everything Harry and JJ described, this isn't shaping up to be just another stop on the Invictus World Tour. This is being built as a homecoming, a full-circle moment for a city that has quietly absorbed some of the worst human cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, and in doing so became the backbone of Britain's entire wounded veteran recovery system. For competitors who went through that exact journey, sand, chaos, evacuation, coma, waking up in a Birmingham hospital bed, competing in the Games in that same city is going to carry a weight that London or Dusseldorf or Vancouver Whistler simply couldn't replicate. It's the difference between hosting an event in a symbolically important location versus hosting it in the actual place where your second life began. And for Harry, personally, this feels like another step in something we've talked about a lot on this channel. His refusal to let his military service become a footnote in a narrative that's mostly obsessed with royal titles, security rows, and tabloid lawsuits. Whatever you think about the broader Sussex versus Firm saga, whatever position you take on RAVEC or security funding or any of the ongoing legal fights, this conversation is a reminder that underneath all of that noise, there's a consistent thread in Harry's public life that predates all of it. His connection to wounded service members and his refusal to let that connection fade just because he's no longer a working royal. We see this pattern over and over. When Harry does something genuinely substantive, founding Invictus in the first place, showing up for veterans years after the cameras have moved on, remembering clinicians' names, tracking individual recovery stories like Josh's, it rarely gets the sustained coverage it deserves. But when there's any hint of family tension, any security dispute, any perceived slight against the institution, that becomes wall-to-wall coverage for weeks. That's not an accident. That's an editorial choice made repeatedly by outlets that have decided which version of Harry sells more units. The version where he's authentically, boringly good at veteran advocacy doesn't move the needle the way a feud does. So the feud gets amplified, and the advocacy gets a 2-minute segment buried in a podcast clip that most casual news consumers will never see. Which is exactly why channels like this one exist. Because someone has to actually sit with the full 11-minute conversation, not just the algorithm-friendly 15-second clip, and explain why it matters. Someone has to connect Ward 412 to the founding myth of Invictus. Someone has to point out that unquantifiable is not a word a PR team hands you. It's a word that comes from someone who actually watched this recovery process happen to people he cared about. So that's the real story behind Birmingham hosting Invictus Games 2027. Not a press release, not a marketing angle, but a genuine, hard-earned connection between a city, a hospital ward, and an entire generation of wounded veterans who found their second life exactly there. Prince Harry and JJ Chalmers didn't need a script to make that case. They just needed to tell the truth about what that airport, those hospital corridors, and Ward 412 actually mean. If this video gave you a different perspective on Harry's veteran work, one you're probably not getting from the tabloids, do me a favour. Hit subscribe, because we're going to keep bringing you the full context the mainstream coverage leaves out. Drop a comment and let me know. Did you know about Birmingham's role in this before today? And as always, squaddies, stay sharp, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.